On March 4th, 1699, the day probably began like any other. Right around where I'm pointing right now, there was a field of Arundinaria gigantea river cane, the bamboo that's native to this area. And some members of the Biloxi Nation were doing a controlled burn of that field. That's burning out the undergrowth, which keeps the plants healthy and produces a lot of other things that can be foraged for. It's a method used to prevent forest fires and other large-scale fires by burning out some of the smaller undergrowth. A prime example of indigenous technology, and one that, as its use declined, led to the increase in forest fires because they were no longer doing controlled burns. It was right over there, an area currently called the French Quarter by some. On March 4th, 1699, while that controlled burn was happening, a ship rounded this bend over here. We're looking downriver, and the ship rounded the bend containing some Frenchmen, led by a man named Iberville. And he and his companions landed their boat over there. They witnessed bison, they witnessed coyotes and possums, and importantly, people. People were already here in this place. 19 years later, they would attempt to rename the place New Orleans. But this place already has a name, and it still has that name. Bolbancha is the name. And Bolbancha is still a place. Yotol, Sla, Ntola, Ishla, Onkike, Jeffery Darensbourg, Takapol Ishak, Yukitiki, Ya Nagoshkenkata, Ya Bolbanchikenkata. I'm Jeffery Darensbourg of the Takapau Ishak Nation of Indians, and I live here in Nungush, as we call it in our language, Ishakoi, and also known as Bolbancha. Nungush means the place, the big village. And Bolbancha is a name in Choctaw, Mobilian, and Chickasaw that means the place of other languages, the place of foreign tongues, the place where a bunch of different languages are spoken. These waters here of the Mississippi River have carried people to this area for trade for thousands of years. Thousands of years. This place is located not only next to this body of water, but also a place that was known as Lake Oquata, which people sometimes call Lake Pontchartrain. It is not a lake in any sense. In fact, it's a saltwater estuary. But in any case, it's near the lake, and it's near a system of bayous, most of which, or many of which, were filled in to make roads. One of the sections that still exists, sometimes known today as Bayou St. John, but also known to indigenous peoples as Bayou Shupik. So people would come here from all over the place to this place because of these waterways, and they would trade. And because they had a bunch of people trading, you would see people who might speak different languages. They would have spoken Choctaw and Biloxi and Tunica and Natchez and Chitamacha and maybe even Chickasaw, and they would have, and Ishakoi, of course, my tribal language that I spoke at the beginning. They would have communicated to each other perhaps most of the time in Mobilian, which is a trade language that was popular around here. When they would greet each other in Mobilian, they would say Ishla, which means you've arrived, and you've arrived at one of my videos for the Indigenous Gulf Stream. I'm Jeffery Darensbourg. I write about mixed people and indigenous populations here. I have been working on promoting the name Bolbancha since 2014. Gave my first talk on it in March of 2014, and I'm a co-founder, along with Ozone 504, of the zine Bolbancha is Still a Place, Indigenous Culture from, quote, New Orleans, end quote. And I am really happy to be speaking to you about one of my favorite topics, Bolbancha. I've published a bunch about Bolbancha, I've spread the word, and now in the city I go to events and I see people with Bolbancha on t-shirts and Bolbancha on mugs, and everyone's talking about Bolbancha. And sometimes I've introduced myself and they have no idea who I am, which I count as a success because it means the word is getting out of the original name. The name here referred to a cosmopolitan place, and when we look over here at this neighborhood that many tourists, tens of thousands of tourists, if not hundreds of thousands of people visit every year, we're looking at a place of many different cultures that have come here. not only Europeans, but also enslaved Africans. On that first visit in March of 1699, Iberville planted some sugarcane seeds somewhere over there. He was planning already to bring enslaved people, enslaved Africans from Haiti here. Many, many thousands of indigenous people were enslaved here. So many women and children were enslaved that it caused a shortage of women in villages, and wars were fought over that. Native people of all genders were taken abroad. And speaking of genders, another legacy here I'll talk about in a bit. But the cosmopolitan aspect of this place as a meeting place for trade is not something that began with the French, and it did not begin with the Spanish, and it didn't begin with any other Europeans. It was something indigenous from the get-go. And even the French market here is kind of a descendant. I'm kind of pointing vaguely at the French market. It's sort of a descendant of the original indigenous markets that were here. I do still hear indigenous languages here. I'm an activist for the promotion of Ishukoi, our tribal language, but I also hear people here speaking Quiche, Quechua, Nahuatl, and Garifuna, and other indigenous languages of the Americas. And also, there are many people here involved in promoting some of Louisiana's own indigenous languages, which is quite wonderful. There are still indigenous people here, and there have always been indigenous people here. Indigenous people lived here and were enslaved here, but also mixed with other people while enslaved and after, and became the Creole population of the Treme neighborhood. The Treme was sort of outside of the so-called city walls. Indigenous people would trade in what is now the garden at the back of the cathedral. Indigenous people would trade outside of the city walls in what is now Congo Square, and we would sing and dance there with African people, and we became mixed with them, which is wonderful because black is beautiful. Regarding the word Bulbancha, I'm happy to see its resurgence. It was a well-known word. Sometime in 2014, I attended a cocktail party with a lot of historians here, and I was talking about sorry, a plane's going over. I was talking about my advocacy for the word Bulbancha, and one of them said if that were a thing, I would know about it, but that person was either did not know how to read or more likely refused to try to read and learn about indigenous people, because the word Bulbancha is recorded in the first ever French publication about this area, which is by Lepage du Prat in 1751, Histoire de la Louisiane, and he spells the word B-A-L-B-A-N-C-H-A, which is probably a good way to spell it if you're a French speaker. I usually spell it B-U-L-B-A-N-C-H-A, which is the spelling that comes from Allen Wright, a Choctaw chief and Protestant minister who was very well educated, went to Union Theological Seminary in New York, which is still a top seminary today, and he thought that's how it's best sound in English, and it was a practical way to write it. I've seen people write the second letter as an A with an underdot, as a V. I use B-U-L because it's something that people understand. And also Allen Wright had a very good grasp of English and Choctaw. You might have heard of him if you haven't, as the person who contributed to the naming of the state of Oklahoma. In any case, I'm very happy to be here in Bulbancha, in this place where my ancestors have lived and traded from time immemorial. And it is still, that imprint of indigenous people is still here, not only in the culture and music, but also the food here. Cornbread is indigenous, red beans are indigenous, crawfish, cayenne pepper, these are all indigenous foods. Pecans, even, things that sometimes people forget are indigenous. Regarding gender, as I mentioned earlier, my own tribe's first visit with Europeans was a Spaniard, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, who was shipwrecked with us in Galveston Bay. And he noticed, he called it a devilish thing, which were men married to other men, and some of them dress like women. There were non-binary and gender, I guess what we call two-spirit people here who were chiefs and leaders of tribes here, including of the Homa, one of the nations that lived here. The primary nations that would live here in Bulbancha, maybe not year-round because it flooded a lot, would be the Homa, Biloxi, Choctaw, maybe on the outskirts, some Chickasaw people, also Akalapisa people. It flooded here a lot, and so it was not always a place of permanent habitation. French thought that in order to control trade, they should build a city here, and they thought they could control the water better than indigenous people who had lived here for thousands of years. And of course, that French effort, after 3 centuries of the best engineering that Western thought could bring to this place has been a colossal failure. It floods here very, very often. Controlling the water here is becoming increasingly difficult, especially with climate change. They could have listened to Indigenous people at the time, and maybe people will listen to us again in the future. Who knows? But we had many bits of wisdom to contribute, not only regarding our acceptance of more than two genders, our acceptance of sexuality other than heterosexual, our willingness to bring people into our population to help refugees, to really try to exercise diplomacy rather than violence. Those are some real lessons to learn, and also our lessons for really taking care of this land and living in a sustainable way. I'm very happy to have been speaking with you. I talked about river cane at the beginning. This is a river cane flute made from cane harvested in the Gulf South by myself and by my friend John DePriest. And John DePriest, who is Choctaw, and I made this flute. I'll play it for you a little bit. Anyway, hueo, as we say in Ishikoi, powerful. That's the word we use for thank you. Hueo for listening, and I hope you enjoy the Indigenous Gulf Stream.